Outer space is not the lawless, ungoverned frontier you may think it is. In fact, there is a framework of agreements, treaties and principles developed at the United Nations during the 1960s and 1970s. But it is 2021, and both time and technology have advanced, with private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin racing for space colonization. If we do not have any global code of conduct or some legal framework regarding space, we are calling for enormous conflicts in the near future. So why is it critical now to have a proper governance framework for space colonization? Well, we'll find out in just a second, but before that, please subscribe to Futurephile to watch more fascinating videos on futuristic tech. For the vast majority of human spaceflight history, the only ones fortunate enough to reach the stars have been professional astronauts hired and trained by government agencies around the world. And 7 courageous travellers who spent millions to spend just a few days on the International Space Station ISS in the early 2000s. But now we are on the cusp of a new era of space exploration, with commercial companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin developing spacecraft that are capable of taking paying travellers beyond the Earth's surface. In fact, we'll possibly see the launch of the space tourism industry within just a few years. And who knows, perhaps we'll also see colonization on Mars by 2050. Now, this raises some burning questions like, who is allowed to engage in colonization activities? In theory, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is the present foundation of extraterrestrial governance and a significant historical milestone, does address this question. Crafted by the US and the USSR in the wake of nearly disastrous conflicts, it specifies that space and natural celestial bodies cannot be taken or claimed by countries, and that space can only be studied and utilized for peaceful reasons. Although the treaty is remarkable, it is more of a symbolic agreement rather than a comprehensive governance framework. It does not really answer the problem of who is permitted to colonize space. For instance, the Outer Space Treaty prohibits nations from claiming sovereignty over the moon or other celestial bodies, but it is silent on whether private companies are allowed to mine or otherwise remove natural resources. Then again, while the treaty prohibits nations from claiming celestial bodies, it also does not give any authority with jurisdiction over space, most significantly, the moon. In the 1970s and 1980s, the international community attempted to address this by ratifying the Moon Treaty, which would have given the international community as a whole authority over the moon. However, only a few nations ratified the treaty, none of which had major space programs, and thus it has little to no relevancy in international law. Other than that, the rate at which the commercial space sector is surpassing the Outer Space Treaty's relevance has generated a slew of issues. One of the provisions of the treaty requires that non-governmental entities be authorized and supervised by their government. While there are authorities in the United States that monitor and control launches and satellites, there is no similar system in place for landing on the moon. Moon Express, a small private company aiming to mine natural resources on the moon, had to come up with a one-time regulatory patch to get approval to send a robotic lander to the moon. And with more private companies wishing to mine the moon for minerals and even use it as a launchpad for missions to Mars, the lack of a legal framework will become a bigger obstacle for the private space industry. However, these were all moon-related issues. So how about beyond the moon? As stated earlier, private companies such as SpaceX are even aiming to use Moon as a launchpad for the mission to Mars. Assume that they were successful. Does this imply that they would claim a portion of Mars merely by physically occupying it? The Outer Space Treaty also addresses this issue, which is the problem of governance within early colonies. The treaty states that the jurisdiction of any spacecraft and any personnel on that spacecraft is the jurisdiction of the spacecraft's or the personnel's country of origin. The principle is simple, and it's been proved to work for complicated international missions like the International Space Station ISS. However, the early colonial government will be unable to depend solely on this principle for 2 reasons. The first is distance. Habitats on Mars or perhaps the moon will be so far away from Earth that implementing the laws of the individual nation of origin would be difficult. It would be inconvenient to have to wait weeks or months for law enforcement from Earth to arrive to investigate a murder committed by a resident of a Mars colony. And the second reason is the complexity of decision-making within colonies. Governance in colonies is concerned with big issues, such as criminal law and the minor, routine yet complicated decision-making requirements that would inevitably develop. Even the most well-trained and disciplined colonists would engage in interpersonal disputes sooner or later. In the context of low Earth orbit missions, conflict resolution can work through direct commands or through aborting missions, but in distant habitats, the colonists will need to have means of local conflict resolution. Colonies are more than mere missions, they are also communities. These communities will need well thought out governance rules to survive, and the country of origin principle is just too basic to be helpful. So what might a working framework of governance in an early colony really look like? Elon Musk, the founder and CEO of SpaceX, has proposed direct democracy as a governance system for a future Mars colony, in which all colonists directly exercise law-making authority rather than choosing representatives to legislative bodies. This approach was determined by the terms and services for Starlink, SpaceX's internet satellite constellation. For services provided to, on or in orbit around the planet Earth or the Moon, these terms and any disputes between us arising out of or related to these terms, including disputes regarding arbitrability, disputes will be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of California in the United States. Accordingly, disputes will be settled through self-governing principles established in good faith at the time of Martian settlement. The question of whether Mars should be free of Earth's order remains unanswered, but Musk's intentions were made more apparent when he mentioned the first government he'd like to see there. Musk projected that the first Martian city would run on direct democracy, akin to the early American representative system. Everyone votes on every issue and that's how it goes. There's a few things I'd recommend. Keep laws short, something suspicious is going on if there's long laws, Musk says. That indeed sounds great in principle. True direct democracy means no parliament, no political elites, and ideally little to no interest group influence and no corruption. However, direct democracy has serious shortcomings. For instance, the colonists would have to adopt a direct democratic system, and non-democratic countries interested in space colonization, such as China, are unlikely to do so since they reject democracy here on Earth. Moreover, the actual realities of true direct democracy are quite challenging. As the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau remarked in 1762, true direct democracy is suitable for gods, not for us fallible humans, because it necessitates an impossible amount of resources. If we were all legislators and administrators all of the time, we would have no resources to pursue any other goals, resulting in an absurd situation in which everyone participates in governing. There is no real direct democracy in the world today, thus there is no reason to believe that any future space colony of any magnitude could be one. Now, if direct democracy isn't a viable alternative for governance, should early colonies proceed oppositely by adopting some type of authoritarian structure to simply get things done? Given how much democracy's reputation as a problem-solving framework has deteriorated in recent years, an authoritarian approach may seem appealing. However, in early colonies, authoritarianism is unlikely to be a sustainable governance framework. It's questionable at best to provide a single colonist or a group of colonists with irreversible decision-making powers. The hazards of an abusive and incompetent dictatorship exceed the possible benefit of a kind and competent dictatorship. Authoritarianism is a bad bet in the long run. Well, the governance of early colonies is indeed a tricky problem. However, we must address the issue before it is too late, especially since these issues are unprecedented in human history, and the need to expand the basics of space law has long been overdue. So, do you think that space colonization governance should be a global priority even today, before colonization is technologically viable? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you like this video, you may also enjoy this next video on why SpaceX's spacesuit is like a tuxedo. That is shown in the end screen. See you there.